Okay, this evening we are in Genesis chapter 35. We have reached chapter 35 in our Genesis series. And we touched on this last time in view of what happened in the last chapter. But we'll go ahead and start here again, since we're going to build off of that. But here we have Jacob and God appearing to him again, giving him instruction once again. And it says here in verse 1 that God said to Jacob, "Arise, go up to Bethel and dwell there, make an altar there to the God who appeared to you when you fled from your brother Esau." So Jacob said to his household and to all who were with him, "Put away the foreign gods that are among you, and purify yourselves and change your garments. Then let us arise and go up to Bethel, so that I may make there an altar to the God who answers me in the day of my distress, and has been with me wherever I have gone." So they gave to Jacob all the foreign gods that they had, and the rings that were in their ears. Jacob hid them under the terebinth tree that was near Shechem. So there is not any confusion about what is going on here, because they give their household idols that they had, and they had the rings in their ears, which was a symbol of loyalty to those gods. Typically it meant that it was a lifelong intention. It was some kind of bond there. A lot of those can just be related to idolatry, but we do have that being as a common practice for a servant to do for a master. And so that does become a meaning later. But we definitely know that both the household gods and the rings were related to idolatry. But we should also connect here that God told him to make an altar to the God who appeared to you when you fled from your brother Esau. That wasn't any of those gods. That was the one true God. And Jacob acknowledges this fact when later on he says that he is going to make an altar to the God who answers me in the day of my distress and has been with me wherever I've gone. So it was not spelled out earlier, but Jacob, we see here, fully recognizes that he was in distress when he didn't know what was going to happen with him and Esau. And the way that worked out and the way Esau received him, he totally credits God with that glory, that God rescued him. And so some of us would say, we may think, Esau was just kind to him, he received him, he forgave him. But in Jacob's point of view, and you may have something that could have a physical explanation in your life, but you know in your heart that it was God that helped you through that moment in time. You could not see that working out the way it did if it was not for God's providence and his care. And Jacob knows this. He doesn't need to prove it to anyone. He knows because of what has been going on in his life that time and how everything worked out. He knows that God cared for him. And so what happened in the last chapter with his daughter Dinah, and we see here that the idols had still been there. They had kept them in the household. I think the one thing that, and we may have mentioned it in passing, but one thing we need to call attention to today is this fact, that one thing we do know is not the same when we have idols, is prayer. And in fact, oftentimes, we may borrow from the book of Colossians in the New Testament that covetousness is idolatry. And we know that because we covet things, whether it's lust or for some, it may be a recurring thing in their life, like alcohol or some kind of drug. Even food can get there. And that can kind of become an idol when we let it take the place of God in our life. And so coveting, wanting more, wanting what someone else has, or wanting what the world has that I currently do not have. And we just want more and more and more. Well, the reason why we borrow that idea is because you may think, or you may be familiar with perhaps something in your life or something that in the past or in someone else's past where this thing was getting in the way between their relationship with God. And it kept getting in the way. And so maybe the reason why they didn't want to pray, and maybe they could have asked for God for help or guidance through it, and what had gotten in the way is that they knew that they had allowed that sin to be there. They had allowed that, if we may use this wording, that idol to be there. When we have an idol, and we're not talking about sin like I messed up, or I'm trying to overcome this, and I slipped up and I said a word or something like that, or I got angry. Although anger can become that same way, a recurring thing. We're talking about these stumbling blocks that recur in our life, and oftentimes when they pop up again, it makes us not want to pray, and we almost feel sometimes like we're requesting God for things, and we know we're asking Him again and again for things, and we almost don't want to do that because we feel we're asking Him for all these, requests, but we're not honoring Him in our deeds and our conduct. But the fact of the matter is, the answer is never to stray further away from God, even if we're dealing with those things. In those moments, we've talked about before, we want to get closer to God, to receive His guidance, to receive His instruction, so that we can learn how to overcome those things. We want to go to His Word, and we want to pray about it so we can get that kind of help. But at the same time, when it comes to these idols, we know this principle is for certain, that we got to get rid of that idol. And if we're able to do that, then God will be able to hear our requests. So let's think of this in a real term. Jacob, for example, if he's encountering something in a land that he's traveling in, he says, "The God who delivers me in the day of my distress." He could pray to God about it, and God has always answered him. So again, we don't want to say what would have happened, or if the idols weren't there, or how it would have played out. We don't know, but I think one thing we can say is that he could have prayed about it. If he had a request, if he had a need, he says, "The God who answers me in the day of my distress." And that's true for all of us. And so we could make a request to God. In the New Testament we have, "Be anxious for nothing, but in prayer and supplication, let your requests be made known to God, and the peace of God, which surpasses all comprehension, will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus." So we can do that, but what is going to get in the way if we have that idol? And the problem here is Jacob and his sons. We don't know how much Jacob is involved, but their household claims responsibility because those idols are still in the household. So either way, Jacob claims responsibility because it has been allowed. The household is there. They have the idols. And so they have these idols, and those idols are stopping them from potentially letting their requests be made known to God. If they had trouble with these people in the land, why not pray to God about it? Why not ask Him for help? If they were unsure about the land they were in, God helped Abraham and Sarah. Even when Abraham was in the wrong and they were going around lying and he was saying that she is my sister, didn't God look out for them when that happened? But the fact is, I think the principle we're seeing here clearly is they got idols in the house, and they got an idol in the life. They got to cast out that idol. It may be difficult. It's like going to war with sin, but we got to go to war with it when we know what the problem is. We got to get that idol out of the house so that we can have that God who will deliver us from these trials, from these things of distress. So Jacob has got to get the idol out of the house, and the idol was there when all these difficult things were happening. But now that he gets the idol out of the house, what is able to happen? Well, let's read on. It says here in verse 5, "As they journeyed, a terror from God fell upon the cities that were around them, so that they did not pursue the sons of Jacob. And Jacob came to Luz, that is Bethel, which is in the land of Canaan, he and all the people who were with him. And there he built an altar, and called the place El Bethel, which means God, the God of Bethel, but Bethel means God's house, so it's almost like saying God or the God of God's house. It's giving ownership to God. Why did he call it that? Because there God had revealed himself to him when he fled from his brother. And Deborah, Rebekah's nurse, died, and she was buried under an oak below Bethel. So he called his name Alon Bakuth. And let's see, I wrote it down. Alon Bakuth means oak of weeping. So just so we know what the significance of these names. But problem solved. God took care of it, right? Now, was God unwilling to do that a couple days ago? Who knows how long it's been? A couple months ago, weeks? He was willing to do it, just knowing the situation and seeing that Jacob was penitent and he removed the idols. You see, the problem isn't what happened or God knew, but why we didn't. We don't even have to ask these questions. If we get rid of the idols, we can let our requests be made known to God, and he's willing to step in and help. And we understand there's a special relationship here because these are the patriarchs and promises were made to them. But the fact is, do bad things still happen in this life? Yes, because other people sin, because it's a sinful world. And, it's not going to be the case where everybody is stopped from doing every single bad thing. However, God is constantly answering our requests when we make them known to him. When we have a problem in the family, or when we have some type of health problem happening to us, the first thing we can and should do, we're bringing it to God in prayer. We're giving that request to him. Because the fact of the matter is, we don't know what God's will is, but if it is his will, he's going to intervene. He's going to help us. And regardless, he's going to hear our prayer and he's going to help us through it. And so, but we got to ask, right? And the fact is, in a situation like this, God can be requested. God can be petitioned. In Luke, where we're getting to, he talks about a woman, and she keeps going to this judge and asking him to give her justice. And he says that this judge really didn't care, but because she kept asking, because he didn't want to hear it anymore, he granted the request. And Jesus' point is, if that's the case, then how much more will God give justice to those who love him and call upon him? And the fact is, when we petition God, he wants to hear that. He wants us to ask because he'll do something. But I think the problem here is that idols were present. There was a barrier there. Whenever there's a barrier, whenever we know we have something present in our life in the home, there's something that's going to stop us from wanting to go to him and ask. And we know that God is not going to put up with idols staying in our life. And so, but the fact is, when we're faithful to him, if we're willing to be penitent, to turn around and get rid of those idols, look how fast God stepped in. Problem solved. And they didn't have to worry about them anymore. And it's not like God had to rain down fire from heaven and do all that. It's just God acted, problem solved. And I'm not saying it always works out that way, but we see the danger of allowing an idol to linger there. And Rachel at first took her household gods, maybe because she attributed the success of Jacob to those idols instead of God. Who knows? But we know for some reason she took the idols. Now Jacob, as the man of the household, leaves them there. We have to ask, if he was able to get rid of the idols here, because this is what he does. He goes to his sons and he says, get rid of all the rings, all the idols. They get rid of them. Why didn't he do that earlier? Because he does it here. And so at some point, the idols were allowed to linger. And I think the message in all this is, don't let the idols linger. If there's something there, even if it's just, I know this is God's wisdom, and now I've learned something, and this is now how I have to go about it. Take care of it, handle it, accept God's wisdom on that, because now nothing is going to get in the way. Nothing is going to cause that separation. So, knowing that, we get to verse 9, and now we have a reminder. We have a repeated statement that God had already told Jacob earlier on. So look there at verse 9. It says, God appeared to Jacob again, and he came to Padan Aram and blessed him. And God said to him, your name is Jacob. No longer shall your name be called Jacob, but Israel shall be your name. So he called his name Israel. So when something recurs like this, something was stated earlier, and something happened in between, and now it's stated again, this is kind of like a theme study. And by looking at themes, in other words, God said, your name will now be called Israel. But all this stuff happened in the meantime, and now God repeats that same theme. So what it tells us, it's a good way to notice that, because that will teach us something about what happened in the middle there. What happened in between this theme. If you go back to when God had told him that, it was in Genesis chapter 32, verse 28. Then he said, your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel. For you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed. So back then he was, if you remember the lesson, he was wrestling with Jacob. And he didn't prevail over Jacob. And this was a sign to us that spiritually speaking, Jacob was wrestling with God in his life. But he should have allowed God to prevail over him. He should have submitted, because that's what we want. That's when things go good. That's when God is looking out for our best case. And he's going to bless us and care for us. But Jacob was struggling with God. He was striving against him. Now we have all this that happens in the middle. Well, God's going to cause the situation with Esau to work out. That's also a repeated theme, because we're reading about that here in this chapter. So this should cause us to go back to this point in time. Well, God delivers him from that situation. It works out with Esau. But he mentions that, I'm going to call you the one who wrestles with God. And now we have in chapter 34 all of this that happens. And now Jacob and his household were placed into a dangerous situation. So I believe what all of this tells us is that there was this in-between period was part of Jacob's wrestling with God. It was a period in his life. They've allowed the idols to stay there. And now they don't have a relationship where maybe they could have prayed to God about it, petitioned him, and it could have been handled. Maybe God could have prevented a lot of it. But the thing is, there's idols there. And they know there's idols there. And it's not God who has failed them. It's the fact that they've turned away from God. And there is betrayal there. And so when we know that there's a right thing to do in our household, maybe in our church, in our assembly, in our family, amongst our friend group, especially if they're Christians, then we got to stand up for the right thing. Even if it may make that relationship uncomfortable, difficult, we have to stand up when we know something is right. And that goes back to the Garden of Eden. Adam, you can't say for sure, but everything we read on the matter is he was there. There's not a verse that says when Adam was standing by the tree. But when we look at everything, she gave the fruit to him and he ate some also. And the fact is, when we read in the New Testament that Adam, it doesn't say Adam was deceived, that in a way makes it worse for Adam, because it means that he knew the right thing to do. And he could have done the right thing, but he failed to do it. And so that is a willful thing. That is a purposeful thing. And so this theme in Genesis, Moses has been talking about it since the garden. And now we're here in chapter 35, and we have some individuals, some men, and they have not stood up for God, and they have not decided to do the right thing. We have to stand up for what's right so that no idols linger in our life, or just any stumbling blocks. So now, that theme's repeated, and it kind of reinforces that. The one who struggles with God. So now, he goes on in verse 11 of chapter 35, and he says, and God said to him, I am God Almighty, be fruitful and multiply. A nation and a company of nations shall come from you, and kings shall come from your own body. Again, this is one of those, when we read books like these, we read it in a very historical way, we read like a story, what's happening next. And so it's easy to read over this. But when God had said a company of nations will come from Sarah, well, how does that make sense? Well, because Isaac's going to come along. You do have Ishmael too. But Isaac is going to have who? Jacob and Esau. Esau's going to become the nation of Edom, and Jacob will become the nation of Israel. There you have two nations. The promise is fulfilled. But we got to pay attention to this here, because now it's talking about Israel. So how is there going to be two nations that come from Israel? I thought Israel was one nation. And when we look at it, we are no doubt staring at a prophecy. Because later on, Israel will do what? The very same thing Israel's household has done here, turn to idolatry. Israel will turn to idolatry when Solomon turns away and he marries all those foreign women, and it says that his heart was turned away from the Lord because he clung to these women in love. He brings the idols in. All of a sudden, the more kings come after him, keeping these idols, and the kingdom is split into north and south. And you have the southern kingdom of Judah and the northern kingdom of Israel. Moses, by the way, has no clue how all of this is going to happen. But he receives a prophecy from God, and he says that be fruitful, multiply, a nation and a company of nations shall come from you. And so he knows, he doesn't know, but God knows that even though this is Jacob, that it's not just going to be one nation. Eventually it will be two. Eventually that northern kingdom will be carried away and it will cease. But even then you still have Samaria. By the time Jesus comes along, you have the Jewish people, and then you have the Samaritans. And by the way, the Jewish people and the Samaritans still very much dislike each other by that time because they know their history. So we're looking at a prophecy of Moses here. So he continues on in verse 12, and he says, the land that I gave to Abraham and Isaac, I will give to you, and I will give the land to your offspring after you. Then God went up from him in the place where he had spoken with him. And Jacob set up a pillar in the place where he had spoken with him, a pillar of stone. He poured out a drink offering on it and poured oil on it. So Jacob called the name of the place where God had spoken with him Bethel. So I think this kind of signifies a new beginning for Jacob. The idols are gone, a covenant relationship renewed. And now, what are we going to do from here? Well, here we see Jacob's faith still, even though he's made some mistakes. He's turned away. He's had some character flaws. But he's not going to leave God. He's going to renew that relationship. And he has faith in it. So it's why he can be called, one of the faithful fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But now in verse 16, we have a life-changing event for him. Verse 16 says, then they journeyed from Bethel. When they were still some distance from Ephrath, Rachel went into labor, and she had hard labor. And when her labor was at its hardest, the midwife said to her, do not fear, for you have another son. And as her soul was departing, for she was dying, she called his name Ben-Oni, but his father called him Benjamin. So Ben-Oni, you could translate that, son of my sorrow, but his father called him Benjamin, son of my strength. So it was sorrowful for Rachel, but it was something that gave his son Benjamin, maybe the meaning is that he found strength in him, and it gave him a reason, an emotional attachment, and it created this love for Benjamin, his young son. So Rachel was the one that Jacob loved really dearly, but when we get, especially when we get into Joseph, and by the time Jacob is a really old man, what we see is that though some tragedies happen, difficult things happen, eventually God causes things that are difficult to work together in his purpose to accomplish his will which is good for everybody. We can't leave out that part. But all things, the way they happen, work out for the family. They work out for the household. But we should keep in mind that he would not be married if he had just, decided to have one wife only and follow God's design. Again, how would this play out if not this way? We don't know. He'd have to go back and change the past. But the fact is, mistakes were made. The family situation got more complicated. Now there is a death that has really affected Jacob. It's going to contribute to a lot of his sorrow. But the fact is, God is going to work these things out for him. I think it kind of shows sometimes we still have to face difficulties when we make choices, when we get in some situations. And this is just a death. It's not necessarily like he was being punished, but when those choices are made and we continue through life, the bright side is, the encouragement is that God is going to work with us from that point forward. And so we have to make the best of it, acknowledge that these choices, these things come with life. It's not because God was wanting to punish someone or he was wanting to take someone no, it's just we make choices. Life happens. It's temporary. It's sinful. We die. People hurt us. All these variety of things that cause pain. But we have to be faithful and see, but God does work things out for good for us. And we're going to see that as we come to the end of Genesis, as we see the end of Jacob's life. Solomon himself would say, time and chance happened to them all. It's not that some things God works through providence, where he wants certain people to meet other people, and he wants some things to happen for our good. But every bad thing that happens, it's not like God's holding the string and he's causing everything. No, sometimes it's just the way of life. Death is part of it. Difficulty is part of it. And it's because we're not meant to be in this sinful world forever. We're meant to go somewhere else. And so pain is promised in this life. And we have to trust that God, if we're faithful to him, he's going to work things out for us. And he's going to help us. And he's going to work out the best possible life we can have with him. If we follow him. And so from this point forward, Jacob has to say, yeah, some bad things have happened, but now I've learned from this point forward, I got to stand by the Lord, and I have to lean on him, and he's going to work things out for me, even if I have some difficulty from things that have already taken place. So verse 22, while Israel lived in the land, Reuben went and lay with Bilhah, his father's concubine, and Israel heard of it. Now the sons of Jacob were 12. The sons of Leah, Reuben, Jacob's firstborn, Simon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun. The sons of Rachel, Joseph, and Benjamin. The sons of Bilhah, Rachel's servant, Dan and Naphtali. The sons of Zilpah, Leah's servant, Gad and Asher. These were the sons of Jacob who were born to him in Padan Aram. So these will become the 12 tribes of Israel. And so really Jesus will have to come, if he's going to fulfill prophecy, he has to come from one of those tribes, and it's Judah. And then the prophecy will get even more specific. He has to come from the family line of David. So it's just amazing when you see how God worked everything out in the plan of Christ. Because you can't look how everything worked out and say it was just coincidence after coincidence after coincidence. We know better than that. And we know that all of these things perfectly leading to Jesus was the working of God. And only someone powerful enough and all-knowing and all-loving would be able to carry out the plan of Jesus. So in verse 27, Jacob came to his father Isaac at Mamre, or Kiriath Arba, which is Hebron, where Abraham and Isaac had sojourned. Now the days of Isaac were 180 years, and Isaac breathed his last, and he died and was gathered to his people, old and full of days. And his sons Esau and Jacob buried him. So it's interesting to me, they thought Isaac was going to pass a long time ago, back when he was going to give the blessing. But he's made it this long, and he's lived to 180 years. And so that shows that God blessed him with a good long life. So then we hit chapter 36. The reason why we mention this is because we don't need to spend a great amount of time on this one. This is mentioning Esau's descendants and that sort of thing. But let's not say it's insignificant. You do have the 9th time this phrase is used. These are the generations of Esau. That is Edom. This is the 9th division of the book of Genesis. And the importance would be is that Edom will become a nation, and they will become a thorn in Israel's side throughout the rest of the history. So, basically, when you follow this generational divider, these are the generations. We've seen it since the beginning. These are the generations of the heaven and earth. These are the generations of Adam, of Noah. So, what God is doing is He's bringing us down a specific line. He could have followed Ishmael's line. He could have followed Esau's line. And He wants us to know, we could talk about all this human history, but I want you to pay attention to Israel. I want you to show how I'm working things out with Israel. Meanwhile, Edom will be a thorn in Israel's side. And so that is the significance of knowing about Esau's descendants and this division here. To us, maybe the specifics don't matter all that much about the name and all this sort of thing. But it does reinforce to us its valuable history, its accurate history. And also to the Israelites reading this at the time, it would be good to know because they were their neighboring country. And so, but it's just good to know that. And then the 10th division is in chapter 37. And now this 10th division is the generations of Jacob. That is going to be the Joseph story. Because now these are the generations, 10th time that phrase is used. And it's going to follow Jacob being sold, being put in prison and delivering. And so this will be the final section of the book of Genesis. And so we'll get to begin that next Sunday night. For now, I think what we can sum this up is, the way we can sum it up, what we went over tonight is, well, maybe too simple for some, but don't leave an idol in your life. You know, we know that we create that barrier with God ourselves. But if we don't have to have that barrier there, then why leave it there? Whatever is stopping us from coming to God, let's act, let's get rid of it, because then we get to make requests for Him. We get to pray. He's going to help us through specific things in our life. So whatever's getting in the way, remove whatever's in that way, because then we're going to be blessed with this close relationship with God, just like you see with Jacob. So we'll go ahead and offer an invitation tonight for anyone who's not put on Christ in baptism. You have that invitation. If you believe the word and ready to repent and confess Him as Lord and be baptized, that's open. If you need prayers of the congregation, need to make anything known, don't hesitate, and you can do so while we sing our invitation song.